The sky over the Mongolian steppe was a relentless, cloudless glare in 1206. Beneath it, the grass had turned to brittle dust. Waterholes that had sustained clans for generations were now nothing but cracked mud. Survival dictated the rhythm of every day. Tribes that had spent centuries raiding each other for scraps of grazing land suddenly found themselves facing a choice: collapse into the dust or unite under a single hand. Temujin moved through this heat, his presence shifting the air in the encampment. He did not ask for loyalty, he demanded a new order. The old blood feuds that had kept these people divided for generations were silenced by a singular, cold ambition. He gathered the chieftains, stripped away the ancient, fractured hierarchies, and forged a unified confederation from the wreckage of the drought. The tension in the air was palpable, a static charge that heralded a storm. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the fragmentation was gone. A new power had taken root in the dry earth. History was no longer a matter of surviving the next season, it was about defining the next century. Temujin dismantled the old world with surgical precision. Birthright and tribal lineage, once the only currencies that mattered, were stripped of their power. He replaced them with a system where rank was earned through performance on the field. A common herder could now command a unit of 10,000 if his skill demanded it. This was not merely a change in command, it was a total reconfiguration of the human engine. The transition was brutal for those who clung to tradition, but efficient for the machine he was building. Discipline replaced the chaos of tribal skirmishes. Every soldier learned to act as a single, synchronized extension of a greater will. By 1211, the transformation was complete. The army turned its back on the familiar grasses of the steppe and stared into the abyss of the Gobi Desert. They moved in silence, thousands of horses kicking up clouds of dust that blotted out the horizon. They were no longer a collection of tribes seeking pasture, they were a professional force of conquest. The desert was a test of endurance, and they passed through it like a blade through silk. Ahead lay the borders of the Jin dynasty. The era of survival had ended. The era of total war had begun. The Great Wall loomed before them, a towering barrier of stone and hardened earth that defied the reach of the steppe cavalry. The Mongol riders pulled their horses to a halt, the silence of the massive fortifications contrasting sharply with the thunderous mobility they were accustomed to. Brute force met immovable stone, and, for the first time, the speed of the horse provided no tactical advantage. The Jin defenders watched from above, confident in their architectural superiority. They assumed the nomads would break against the perimeter. They were wrong. Temujin saw the wall not as an obstacle, but as a puzzle to be solved through intellectual leverage. He ordered the capture of local engineers, forcing them to turn their expertise against their own masters. These scholars and builders were brought into the camp, their knowledge of levers, counterweights, and siege engines integrated into the Mongol structure. The transformation was profound. Overnight, a nomadic raiding force became a sophisticated military machine capable of dismantling the most entrenched sedentary defenses. They constructed trebuchets and rams that turned the Jin fortifications into crumbling piles of masonry. The nomads had learned to conquer the earth itself. They were no longer just riders, they were architects of ruin, systematically dismantling the foundations of the civilized world with the very tools meant to keep them out. By 1219, the Silk Road functioned as the vital artery of global commerce. It was a fragile piece, stitched together by mutual profit and the reach of the Khwarezmian Empire. Genghis Khan had sought to secure this flow of goods, sending a massive caravan laden with silks and metals toward the western outpost of Otrar. The mission was strictly commercial. Then, the silence from the west was broken by a single, brutal report. The governor of Otrar had seized the goods and slaughtered the entire party. The news reached the Mongol camp like a physical shockwave. The diplomatic mask fell away. This was not merely a theft of wealth. It was a direct challenge to the authority that governed the steppe. The geopolitical balance, once maintained by the promise of trade, tilted instantly toward war. Genghis Khan did not debate or negotiate. He mobilized the Tumans. The preparation was cold and methodical, a total alignment of military resources focused on one singular objective: the eradication of the Khwarezmian state. The era of the merchant ended, and the era of the punitive campaign began. Every forge in the camp hammered steel into arrowheads. Every rider sharpened his resolve. The target was set. The path to the west was no longer a road for trade. It was a corridor for vengeance. The horizon darkened as the Mongol columns reached the fertile heart of the Khwarezmian Empire. Samarkand and Bukhara, jewels of the desert, stood as the final barriers. The siege was not a battle, it was a process of erasure. Mongol engineers deployed their machines, smashing the gates and pouring into the streets. The destruction was absolute. Stone towers collapsed into the squares, and the dust of pulverized masonry choked the air. But the true catastrophe occurred in the fields beyond the walls. The conquerors targeted the irrigation canals that sustained these cities. They breached the dikes and diverted the water, turning verdant gardens into barren salt flats. The lifeblood of the empire drained into the sand. As the cities fell, the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of lost centuries. The nomadic victors looked upon the ruins they had created and realized that to hold this territory, they could no longer simply ride on. They had to govern. The tents of the steppe were replaced by the administrative centers of the fallen. They began to collect taxes, record populations, and manage the very systems they had dismantled. The raiders were becoming the rulers, anchoring their power in the broken foundations of the world they had just systematically dismantled. By 1260, the fractured khanates achieved a paradoxical stability. The Silk Road, once a contested frontier, became a unified highway under the Pax Mongolica. Merchants traveled from the ports of Venice to the gates of Cambaluc with relative safety. Caravans flowed like blood through a vast interconnected body. Yet, this very efficiency created a fatal vulnerability. In the 1340s, the speed of commerce outpaced the barriers of nature. The same paths that carried silk, spices, and diplomatic envoys also facilitated the silent movement of the Yersinia pestis bacteria. The pathogen moved through the dense markets and cramped hostels of the trade hubs, hitching rides on fleas and rodents. It bypassed mountains and deserts, thriving in the newfound closeness of the Eurasian world. What began as an era of unprecedented cultural and economic integration became the conduit for a global tragedy. The empire that had conquered the landscape with steel and fire was now being dismantled by an invisible, microscopic force. The interconnected world, once the pride of the Mongol administration, started to collapse under the weight of a pandemic that knew no borders and respected no imperial decree. The world was shrinking, and it was dying. By 1368, the mandate had vanished, the Yuan dynasty collapsed, and the Mongol influence across the heart of China dissolved into the dust of history. What remained in the wake of this rapid expansion was silence. In the ruins of Karakoram, stone foundations lay half-buried under the encroaching steppe grass, the only physical evidence of a capital that once commanded half the world. Artifacts scattered across the plains, broken pottery, rusted iron, and weathered seals tell a fragmented story of an empire that rose and fell in the blink of a historical eye. We are left to weigh the cost. Was this vast confederation a catalyst that forced the world into a new era of integration, or was it merely a violent, fleeting interruption in the natural trajectory of human civilization? The administrative records remain buried, and the true extent of their cultural footprint is still being unearthed by researchers today. History is rarely a closed book. It is a series of broken pieces, waiting for the next discovery to shift our perspective once more. The empire is gone, but the questions it left behind continue to echo through the landscape, demanding answers that the earth is only just beginning to surrender.